Good morning. And if you have your Bibles, I'd like to invite you to turn to Matthew chapter 9 or your phones or whatever way in which you carry your word. Open to Matthew chapter 9. We'll be referring to it a number of times. Before I get into the message, I would like to say a word of thanks. On Christmas Eve 2013, Joy and I walked into Heartland Church Connected for the very first time. And our story was completely unknown to you, as is the case with most visitors that walk in through the doors. You just don't know where they're coming from. And for us, we'd been through a couple of very difficult years. And the months leading up to that Christmas Eve service, my mother had passed away due to Alzheimer's. I'd been in ministry for 30 years and was burnt out. And I suddenly found myself without ministry, without a job, without a purpose, unable to work a full day. We were just alone and we were hurting. And we came to Heartland Church Connected, to be perfectly honest, to find a place to hide and find a place to heal. And on Sundays, we would be those ones that would slip in and slip out, hoping not to talk to anyone. Because if we talked to anyone, there was that danger of our story coming out, and we just weren't ready to talk. So as the weeks went by, as the months went by, we benefited from the worship team. We benefited from our times of worship. We benefited from Pastor Joel's ministry. And we'll always appreciate that so much. And God, who does things in his own way and does things in his own timing, began his work of healing. You were a part of that. And we appreciate that. And eventually, he opened up the doors to a whole new purpose, a purpose that goes way beyond our imagination. And we want to thank you, Heartland, again, that God used you and he continues to use you. We want to thank you for your ongoing support and your prayers. And as I share, we want you to know that this is something that you helped make happen. God used you in this, and God is using you, and so we so appreciate it. How did we get involved in Indigenous ministries? That's, by the way, is the way I'm feeling inside, that noise. It's just coming out. How did we get involved in Indigenous ministries? Well, you know what? It really wasn't anything dramatic. We didn't have a vision. We didn't have a dream one night. We weren't suddenly filled with a love for Indigenous people. It just happened. And it happened in a way that happens to so many other people, God's people. It's a pattern that we find in Matthew chapter 9, verse 35. I'll put it up on the screen there for you. You can look in your word. Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. And when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. We're going to highlight or circle three words in that passage. The word went, the word saw, and the word compassion. In obedience to his Father, Jesus went out into the communities. He went out into the villages and he taught. He proclaimed the gospel. And as he went out into those communities, he saw the people, and he saw their needs, he saw their hurts, he saw their lack of purpose, and he saw them as they were. They were harassed, helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And when he saw them, he had compassion. What's happening here in this passage can happen to any one of us at any time. It can happen to us as we go into our neighborhoods. It can happen to us as we go into our workplaces. It can happen to us as we go into those special interest groups, whether it be with student ministries or children's ministries or whatever, or working with the marginalized. When we take that step and go, suddenly we see people as they are. We see their hurts. We see where they are at. And we have compassion on them. And God will sometimes open some doors. Our hearts were touched, and the compassion began to grow. And God answered prayers as we sought his direction. And the First Nation people were no longer people that we saw in Westerns. First Nation people were no longer the people that we saw in the news, maybe protesting pipelines or protesting in other ways. They were people with names, people with faces, people who were hurting, people whose suffering is linked to the past, a past that many of us are unaware of, but something we need to know in order to be able to understand where our First Nation people are coming from. Sir John A. Macdonald in 1883 stood up in Parliament and said, "When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages. He is surrounded by savages. And though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thought are Indian. It is simply a savage who can read and write. It has been strongly pressed on myself as the head of the department that Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence, and the only way to do that would be to put them in a central training industrial schools where they will acquire the habits and modes of thought of white man." Now, I'm not here to judge the past, and I'm certainly not suggesting that we should go around and tear down the statues of Sir John A. Macdonald, because this isn't just about Sir John A. Macdonald. This is about us, Canada. This is the attitude that was there at the time. And this is the attitude in which the residential schools came out of. In those residential schools, children were taken from their parents. Children were taken from their communities. They were transported miles away in the hopes of taking the Indian out of the Indian. And you've probably heard of some of the residential school horror stories that came as a result of government policy, and yes, sadly, as a result of the church. For the church was very much involved in this. In those residential school situations, there was disease that spread, and little was done about it. And they feel that about 4,000 children died in those residential schools. In other words, parents sent their children to school and never saw them again. There were starvation experiments conducted on students at 6 residential schools. Children were intentionally kept malnourished. Parents knew nothing about it. They were given food with experimental additives, and many became sick. There was physical, emotional, mental, and sexual abuse that took place. And some of the older students that were abused turned around and started abusing the younger ones. The abused became abusers, which sometimes happens. Thankfully, the residential schools have shut down. And some would say, well, that's the past. Let's move on. And yes, the schools have closed, but the effects of those residential schools continue to linger. Like one father who told me I don't know how to be a father. I've never seen it done. While sitting with a group of community leaders, they were sharing their stories, and one of the individuals that shared his story told me of how he had been through the residential school situation and how he had married and had children, and now he had grandchildren. And he said, "You know what? I've got grandchildren, and I'm just starting to learn how to show love." The reality is, and this is a quote from the book Seven Fallen Feathers, but it sums it up well. The intergenerational trauma from the residential school experience is entrenched. 100 years of social exclusion, racism, and colonialism has manifested as addiction, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and lack of knowledge on how to parent a child. Few of the kids discuss the sexual abuse they've suffered. Yet more than 80% of the children and youth in Indigenous residential treatment centers come from homes where they are sexually abused. So those are some of the challenges. Some of the other challenges that we're finding, and this is not true of all communities. This is very much true in the communities that we've gone to, and the communities that we've been focusing on are north of Thunder Bay. You may have heard of Ralph Lowe. He was a priest that traveled from community to community, a pedophile. They estimate abused about 500 children. One of these communities is the community of Weagamo, where I was just 2 weeks ago. And where the church once stood in that community is now an empty lot because they've torn it down, hoping to erase the past. Fortunately, there are other churches there, but that empty lot is always there for them. And it still haunts the community. People like men by the name of Williams was abused when he was 7 years old. By the age of 14, he was struggling with addiction. And he went to prison several times. It was almost 20 years before he was able to confront his past. Today, fortunately, his life is on track. Many communities, many families carry the scars. And this is a barrier to ministry. It's a barrier to reaching out. The simple things that we enjoy, like fresh water, place to live, things that we take for granted, they don't always have. Weagamo is a lot better off than many other communities, but when we were up there, we couldn't drink the water. They have a lagoon. This picture, they have a lagoon where all the waste goes. It was constructed in the 1990s. And it's been leaking every year in the spring since 1997. The water comes out of the lagoon and threatens the fresh water, and this year was particularly bad, and so when we went, we couldn't drink the water, and so all the water had to be boiled. Many of the people in the community simply drink the water. Every day when I was in Pikangikum, and you've heard Pikangikum in the news, as people are being evacuated, I was there last weekend. And every day, walk by down the streets and walk by some houses, and you see that house up, there's the tanks over to my left, and there's that little house just behind there. At one point, there were 26 people living in that house. Poverty is a serious issue. It's made worse by the housing shortages. It's made worse by the high prices. Milk in some communities can cost about $17 a bag. Gas, when I was up in Big Trout last year, was $2.10 a liter. Diapers can be $100. If You decide to make yourself a pie, that can of pie filling may cost you about $8.75. Unemployment in some communities can be very high as 80%. And it's not because they're lazy, it's because there's just no work. In some communities, educators say that up to 70% of children and youth have unaddressed special needs. Many of them go unidentified. If there are issues that need to be diagnosed, they can't be done in the community, and they need a referral to get out of the community. And if they go out of the community, if the mother and father take their child out of the community to go to Thunder Bay, round-trip airfare for the three of them can be $2,400 just to go to see a specialist. One mom said her son was identified with epilepsy when he was 22 years of age, and the only reason they found out was because he was in trouble with the law, and they diagnosed him. He had been living with it all his life, and they didn't know it. When he was upset, he'd go rigid. They didn't realize that he was having seizures. Suicides are a serious issue, and perhaps you've seen that in the news. Last year, I was in the community of Big Trout, and we were visiting with a man in his living room in a small house. He was sharing how his adopted son, how he had committed suicide, and how they had found him right over there, as he pointed over in the doorway in his house. He said, we came in and we tried to revive him, but we couldn't. In Pikangikum, where we were last weekend, you can see crosses in the front yards. Many of them indicating where some of their children have been buried because of suicide. I left there Monday. Tuesday, a 16-year-old took his life. Now they're dealing with the fires. It affects everyone because everyone knows everyone. Kids dream of death. I heard one story where a child dreaming of death was given the date he would die. Many communities, another issue they're dealing with is many communities up north don't have high schools, so they have to send their children away. Can you imagine sending those who have 14 and 15-year-olds, can you imagine sending them to a city far away from you, away from your community? So they send these young children, and some of them end up in Thunder Bay, and that scares them because there's such hatred and racism there towards the people. There's one community that started a girls' hockey team. They came down to Thunder Bay to participate in a team in a tournament, and they decided they'd never return because of the abuse that they put up with. It's sad, and there are students there that have been murdered. And the drugs and the alcohol are available, and there's no parents to watch out for their children, and so many of the children get caught up in that. And so they're scared to send their kids to school. Now, that's not true of all communities, but it's true of some. And when you go, when you interact with the people, and you see what they're going through, you can't help but have compassion. You can't help but feel for them. And so last January, I was asked to be the Family Life Director for Development for Indigenous Ministries. It's kind of a fancy title, so I'll just put it this way. This is what my job is to bring help and hope to families, Indigenous families across Canada. 1.6 million people, and by Indigenous I mean First Nation people, Inuit people, and Métis. That's a scary task. A tad bit overwhelming. When I graduated from Bible college, I took these tests and was told that I wouldn't be very good at cross-cultural ministry, so to stay away from it. So I thought, fine, I'm not interested anyway. It's totally out of our comfort zone. We have to raise our own support in order to do it. I don't know a lot about the people. 1.6 million people, I'm the only one on staff with this focus. So when I go to work in the morning and have a staff meeting, it's just me. And there's some advantage to it because if I make a decision, everyone agrees. And we're good to go. No problems arranging staff meetings. If I'm there, everyone's there. One day I was sitting in my office. I don't know if I was having a staff meeting or not. I never know when that's happening. And I was thinking, I'm not alone in this. No way I'm alone in this. You remember when Moses was leading the people of Israel to the promised land and he was about to hand over the leadership to Joshua? And he gathered the people together, gathered Joshua together, and he gave them these words. He said, you know that place that you're going into? God's already there. And you know that journey that you are on? God's with you on that journey. And you know what? God's not going to abandon you. He's not going to leave you or desert you. And that's what we are discovering. As we move forward in this ministry, God's already ahead of us. He's already where we're going. We've also discovered that God is journeying with us. We're not alone. And we know that God's not going to abandon us. He's not going to get bored with this cause and move on to something else and say, well, Dan, you've got it. Go for it. He's not going to do that. He's ahead of us. He's with us. And he'll never leave us or desert us. So we're not alone in this. And you know what? We've been blessed with a huge resource. And I'd like to say that we were provided with this big building in Winnipeg where there's, thousands of Indigenous people, and we're going to open up this center, and it's in the middle of Canada, and we can reach out to the rest of Canada, but I'm not here to say that. As nice as that would be, that's not the resource I'm talking about. It's something better. And I could say that we've been given $2 million to work with, and that would be nice. What I could do with $2 million. Maybe I should play basketball. But $2 million. I've got a resource that is better than a huge building in Winnipeg. I've got something that is better than $2 million. It's an incredible resource. You know what that resource is? It's the Indigenous people themselves. We are going to offer help and hope to 1.6 million Indigenous people living in remote communities and in large city centers right across this nation. And we are going to do it through the Indigenous people, because Indigenous people are the best people to reach out to Indigenous people. We're going to raise up teachers and speaker couples right across the country who will be able to go into the communities and go into the major centers and be able to teach about marriage and family, to bring help and hope. But not only that, but to introduce people to the one who is their help and hope. We're going to raise up leaders to give leadership to the ministry. We're going to raise up what we call home builders. Home builders is a family life term that we just use to refer to people who do whatever they can, wherever they are, to bring help and hope to others. We want to see home builders established in each of these remote communities, in each of these city centers. So how's it going? Well, right now we're in the middle of a 4-week effort into 4 remote communities north of Thunder Bay. As I mentioned, I've been to Wee-Agamo, been to Pikangikum. I'm here this weekend, but while I'm here, there's a team that's up in Big Trout. You can see the map up there pointing out those places. They're about 500 kilometers north of Thunder Bay. After Big Trout, next weekend, I'll be going to Fort Hope. We now have 6 speaker couples. 4 speaker couples are Ojibwe and Métis, and they live in First Nation communities here in Ontario. We've got 2 First Nation couples that are Cree that live in Quebec. In August, those couples in Quebec will be doing workshops in Quebec. These speakers do an incredible job. Far better than Joy and I could, far better than our directors of family life could, and they're tremendous speakers. But these First Nations couples, they speak where the people are at. And so when they get up and talk, I wish I could put the pictures up of them, but I don't want to give their stories away and put on the internet or anything, but they don't mind me sharing this. These First Nation couples will just talk about their own abuse. They'll talk about their turn to alcohol. They'll talk about the fights that they've had. They'll talk about the way in which they threw each other out of their homes, and they'll kind of giggle about it and laugh about it. But they'll talk about the struggles that they have as families and marriages. And the couples will listen and they'll soak it in because that's where they're at. They'll talk about all that, and then they'll talk about Jesus and how he changed everything. We've got one couple that came to a weekend getaway. They told me that they were going to split up, but they came to that getaway and God got a hold of them. And now they're one of our speakers, doing a fantastic job. And couples, as a result of their ministry, are finding that there is hope. If they can make it, we can make it. And they're making decisions that they do want to be together for good. They're making decisions that they want to have Christ at the center of their relationships. And they're making decisions that they want to turn around and help others. You remember when I shared about the loneliness and the brokenness we experienced in 2013? Well, today, some of my closest friends, people that I love, respect, and admire, are Indigenous couples that we have the opportunity to serve with. Amazing couples whom God has totally transformed. And together we're going to reach out to the 1.6 million Indigenous people by raising up other Indigenous leaders, speakers, and home builders. We are creating teaching materials, and we're not producing materials that are for the Indigenous people. We're working alongside the Indigenous couples to produce materials that are created by Indigenous people for Indigenous people. Us white guys have messed up a lot over the years. So conscious of making mistakes. And I'm so grateful that we've got Indigenous couples that'll set me in the right direction, that are working alongside us. God is going before us. And the doors are, and one of the other things I neglected to mention is that we're working with ministries. So with other churches and other ministries. So as materials and indigenous leaders and working with current ministries. But God is going before us. The doors are opening. And you, through your support and prayers, are helping us to walk through them. So we thank you. You know, the reserves and cities have all kinds of people who are in need of help and hope. But you know, every day our paths cross with people who need help and hope, whether it be in our schools, workplace, our neighborhoods. And we can come across them at any time. Last month, we had the privilege of visiting our grandkids out in Airdrie, Alberta. And it's a beautiful area. We went for a drive up into the mountains. I think they're trying to convert us into becoming Albertians or something, showing us the wonders. It's just a beautiful place. And so we went up into the mountains and we pulled over and went to a Starbucks. And yes, they have Starbucks there. And they went into Starbucks. I'm sorry, I'm not a big Starbucks fan. So I sat in the vehicle with a couple of the grandkids while they ran in to get their drinks. And while I'm sitting there, there's this First Nation man sitting on a bench just a few feet away from me. And I'm watching him, and he's watching people go back and forth, and he's just sitting there. And I'm sitting in the vehicle thinking, oh, should I or shouldn't I? Should I or shouldn't I? And I think, yeah, I should. And so I got out of the car, and I stepped over to him, and we began to talk. And it turns out that this gentleman had just gotten out of the hospital, and he showed me his ID bracelet, and he was going to go on his way back to his nation. He said, but hitchhiking back, and I think I need to eat something first before I go. So as we talked, I asked him, I said, well, what kind of food do you like? And he said, a big smile on his face. And he said, Chinese. He loves Chinese food. And so we look around, and just happens, you know, there's a grocery store across the parking lot that has this little luncheon buffet thing with Chinese food in it that you can. And so the rest of the family came out of the Starbucks, and I said, hey, just be a minute. And so I went with this gentleman across the parking lot towards the grocery store to get some Chinese food. And while we were walking, he was sharing his story. And he told me how his wife had been murdered and how he was raising his daughter on his own. That his health wasn't all that great. That's why he was in the hospital. And it was a struggle. And I asked him, you know what, I don't know much about the First Nations around here. Where are you from? And he told me. And then he started telling me how to say different words like hello and thank you and all that. And had a great conversation, went into the store, got some Chinese food, came out, ate it at the table, and we just talked for a few minutes. And we said our farewells. He thanked me. Man in need. I was sitting in that vehicle minding my own business. I was just a few feet away from a man who had been in the hospital. His wife had been murdered. He was raising a child on his own. He was hungry and had to hitchhike back to his hometown. Who knew? Who knew unless we go? And when we went, we saw. When you see, the compassion comes. That's true of all of us. We all have hurting people. $1.6 million people is a lot of people. In that passage, it doesn't end there. Jesus goes on and he says these words. The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. Maybe there are some here this morning that would like to take up this cause and pray. Pray for workers, Indigenous people that will rise up right across this nation. Speakers, leaders, home builders, people who do whatever they can, wherever they are, to touch their own communities. God says, ask. Ask for the workers. If you would do that for us, we'd sure appreciate it. You've done so much for us already and are continuing to do so much, and we do appreciate it. If you'd like our email to receive our newsletter, it's just let me know, Dan@familylifecanada.com or joy@familylifecanada.com, or you can ask for my card afterwards, and we can connect, and we'll send our newsletter on to you. I'd be glad to do that. I should got 2 minutes maybe. I should tell you about Pikangikum. Watch the news. You'll see them being evacuated. I haven't heard this morning where things are at, but if you could be in prayer for that community. Just this past week, this is a week in Pikangikum. Sunday when we were there was a 45-year-old man who works at the school, father, husband, loved by the community, a believer in Christ. Suddenly dropped dead of a heart attack. The community is trying to absorb that and deal with it, and 2 days later, a 16-year-old commits suicide. A day later, they're having to evacuate because of fires. That's Pikangikum. It's a hurting place. It's a very dark place. But God is there too, working through his people. And his people there need prayer. So if you see the news, see Pikangikum, would you mind saying a prayer? I didn't think I'd get through this. Thank you so much for your ministry. God bless.